Martin Shaw stood in his driveway on a crisp autumn morning, coffee mug in hand, staring in disbelief at the 6-foot fence that had materialized overnight along his property line. The wooden barrier extended a full 3 feet past where any reasonable boundary should be, effectively blocking part of the concrete driveway he used for 15 years. His right-hand tire would now scrape against the fence posts every time he tried to park his truck. The coffee in his mug trembled as his hand began to shake with anger. "What in the hell?" he muttered, steadying his mug on the hood of his truck before walking over to inspect this wooden monstrosity. The fence wasn't just an eyesore. It was a deliberate provocation. Fresh cedar planks gleamed in the morning sun, still smelling of sawdust and varnish. The posts had been sunk deep and cemented in place, a testament to permanence that made Martin's stomach tighten. This wasn't a temporary boundary marker. This was a declaration of war. Martin knew exactly who was responsible. He glanced over at the neighboring Victorian-style house where Elaine Winters had moved in just 3 months ago. The retired school administrator had wasted no time making improvements to the property that had sat vacant for nearly a year. First came the garden gnomes, dozens of them, arranged in military precision along her front walkway. Then the wind chimes, hanging from every available branch, turning gentle breezes into cacophonous jangling that kept him awake at night. But this was different. This crossed a line, literally. Marching across his lawn, Martin rapped his knuckles against Elaine's front door with enough force to rattle the stained glass inset. A minute passed before the door swung open to reveal his neighbor, already dressed in pressed slacks and a cardigan despite the early hour, her silver hair arranged in perfect waves. "Good morning, Mr. Shaw," she said coolly, as if she hadn't just erected a barrier that would make his daily life measurably more difficult. "Is there something I can help you with?" "The fence," Martin said, gesturing back toward the offending structure. "It's on my property." Elaine's thin smile never wavered. "Actually, I had a survey conducted last week. The property line extends exactly to where the fence has been placed." She produced a rolled document from a side table in her entryway and unfolded it with practiced precision. "You can see here that your driveway has been encroaching on my land for some time. I've simply reclaimed what's rightfully mine." Martin stared at the survey, his contractor's eye immediately recognizing that boundaries were wrong. The original developer had established the property lines decades ago, and he'd seen those plans when he purchased his home 15 years earlier. "This can't be right," he insisted. "I assure you it is," Elaine replied, rolling up the document. "I've filed the updated survey with the county. Everything is quite legal." "Legal doesn't make it right," Martin protested. "I've been using that driveway for 15 years. "And now you'll use slightly less of it," she replied, her smile tightening. "I suggest you practice your parking skills, Mr. Shaw. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a busy day ahead." The door closed in his face before he could respond, leaving Martin seething on the porch. As he turned to leave, dark clouds gathered suddenly overhead, the bright autumn day giving way to an ominous darkness that matched his mood perfectly. The weather report had called for clear skies all week, but as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, Martin sensed something in the air, a shifting pressure, a subtle electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up. In the distance, thunder rumbled. Not an ordinary thunder, but something deeper, more resonant, almost like laughter. Martin hurried home as the rain intensified, unaware that Mother Nature had just taken notice of Elaine's fence, and apparently, she didn't approve of it either. The storm that arrived that morning lingered for 3 days, unleashing torrential downpours that transformed the quiet suburban neighborhood into something resembling a wetland. Martin spent those days begrudgingly adjusting to his new reality, scraping his truck's side against the fence twice before finally mastering the tighter turn into his driveway. Each scratch in his paint job deepened his resentment toward Elaine, who remained smugly ensconced in her Victorian home, occasionally peering through lace curtains to observe his struggles. On the morning of the 4th day, the rain finally ceased. Martin stepped onto his front porch, surveying the aftermath. His yard resembled a shallow pond, water pooling in every depression. The neighborhood storm drains gurgled as they struggled to process the deluge. But it was Elaine's property that caught his attention, specifically the area where her new fence met the ground. The soil around the fence posts had transformed into a muddy soup. The water had carved channels along the fence line, exposing the concrete footings that anchored the posts. Several sections already listed at precarious angles like a row of dominoes mid-fall. Martin couldn't help the smile that crept across his face. "Morning, neighbor," called a cheerful voice. Jerome Patterson, a retired meteorologist who lived across the street, crossed over to join Martin on his porch. The older man had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone and had become something of a mentor to Martin over the years. "Some storm, huh?" Jerome remarked, shaking his head. "Haven't seen rainfall like that since the flood of '97. Strange thing is, the weather station 10 miles north barely registered an inch of rain. Seems like this storm had a particular interest in our little street." Martin raised an eyebrow. That is strange. Jerome nodded toward Elaine's fence. That new boundary line doesn't look too steady. Ground's too saturated to hold those posts properly. He lowered his voice. Between you and me, I saw your dispute the other day. That survey she flashed around? Something's fishy about it. You think? Martin said, unable to keep the sarcasm from his voice. I know, Jerome replied firmly. My property backs up to both of yours. Been here 40 years. The original developer was my brother-in-law. I've seen the real plans. Martin's interest piqued. So she's lying. Jerome shrugged. Let's just say creative interpretation of boundaries is nothing new around here. But usually nature has a way of sorting these things out. He glanced at the sky with an odd expression, especially when someone takes what isn't rightfully theirs. As if on cue, a sharp cracking sound echoed across the yard. One of the fence posts had surrendered to gravity, toppling sideways and bringing down a 6-foot section of cedar planking. The fallen section revealed Martin's driveway once more, the concrete now clearly visible. Would you look at that? Jerome murmured, a knowing smile playing at his lips. Mother Nature doesn't seem to agree with Ms. Winter's survey. Before Martin could respond, Elaine's front door flew open. She emerged wearing rubber boots and a rain slicker despite the clear sky, marching purposefully toward the collapsed section. When she spotted Martin and Jerome watching from across the yard, her face contorted with indignation. This is your doing, she shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at Martin. You sabotaged my fence. Martin raised his hands innocently. I haven't touched your fence, Ms. Winters. Been inside waiting out the rain, just like everyone else. You expect me to believe this happened naturally? Elaine sputtered, gesturing at the fallen section. The posts were cemented 2 feet deep. Mother Nature can be quite persuasive when she wants to be, Jerome offered casually, especially when things aren't where they're supposed to be. Elaine narrowed her eyes at the old meteorologist. Stay out of this, Mr. Patterson. This is between me and him. She turned back to Martin. I'll have a crew out to rebuild it by tomorrow, and I'll be installing cameras to make sure you don't interfere again. As she stomped back to her house, another loud crack resonated across the yard. A second section of fence wavered, then collapsed with a resounding splash into the mud. Jerome chuckled softly. Might want to wait for the ground to dry out before rebuilding, he called after her. Elaine slammed her door without responding. You know, Jerome said quietly to Martin, there's an old saying my grandmother used to tell me. The earth remembers what belongs where. Strange how sometimes things just have a way of righting themselves. Martin stared at the fallen fence, a peculiar sensation washing over him, as if the land itself had intervened on his behalf. In the mud where the fence had stood, he could have sworn he saw the ground shift ever so slightly, like the earth was breathing a sigh of relief. True to her word, Elaine had a crew at her property by 7 a.m. the next morning. Martin watched from his kitchen window as 3 men in matching uniforms unloaded lumber and equipment from a truck emblazoned with Premier Fencing Solutions. This time, they were installing metal posts, galvanized steel anchored in concrete twice as deep as before. Martin's heart sank as he watched them work with methodical efficiency, each post sunk precisely where the previous ones had failed. Going with the nuclear option, I see, Jerome remarked, appearing at Martin's side door with 2 cups of coffee. Martin had invited him over to discuss strategies, but watching the new fence take shape made any plan seem futile. Those aren't coming down in a rainstorm, Martin muttered, accepting the coffee with a grateful nod. Jerome watched the workers with narrowed eyes. No, probably not. He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. But water isn't the only element at nature's disposal. By midday, the new fence stood complete, metal posts with cedar planking identical to the first but fortified against collapse. Elaine made a show of walking the perimeter, inspecting each section with exaggerated care before handing the foreman a check. As the crew packed up, she caught Martin watching from his window and offered a smug wave. That evening, Martin sat on his back porch with a beer, contemplating his options. He could hire a lawyer and contest the survey, but legal battles with neighbors rarely ended well for either party. He could retaliate with an eyesore of his own, perhaps a comically large statue facing her bedroom window, but that would only escalate tensions. You're overthinking it, Jerome said, joining him uninvited but not unwelcome. The older man lowered himself into an Adirondack chair and gazed up at the darkening sky. Sometimes you just need to let things take their natural course. The natural course is me having to buy a narrower car, Martin replied bitterly. Jerome chuckled. Patience was never your strong suit. He pointed toward the western horizon where strange clouds were forming. Not storm clouds exactly, but swirling patterns of vapor that seemed to be organizing themselves into shapes. Beautiful sunset tonight. Winds shifting direction. Indeed, a breeze had picked up, unusually warm for the season, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something vaguely metallic. The leaves in the trees began to rustle, then shake violently as the breeze intensified into gusts. Within minutes, the wind was howling through the neighborhood, bending tree trunks and sending unsecured objects tumbling down the street. "Might want to move your truck into the garage," Jerome suggested calmly, seemingly unperturbed by the sudden gale. "Wind like this can bring down branches." Martin hurried to secure his vehicle, struggling against the force of the wind to open his garage door. As he maneuvered his truck inside, he noticed the metal fence posts beginning to vibrate. The wind seemed to be concentrating around Elaine's property, forming what almost looked like a localized dust devil directly over the fence line. From her house, Elaine emerged onto her porch, clutching at the doorframe as the wind threatened to sweep her off her feet. Her perfectly coiffed hair went wildly around her face as she stared in horror at her fence. The metal posts were now bending, not breaking, but slowly, inexorably warping as if they were being heated and reshaped by invisible hands. Martin emerged from his garage just in time to witness an astonishing sight. The entire fence was being contorted, each post twisting away from his driveway, pulling the attached cedar planks with them. The concrete anchors, supposedly set deep in the earth, rose from the ground as if being pushed from below, the soil itself rejecting their presence. Elaine screamed something that was lost in the roar of the wind. Her face was a mask of disbelief and fury as she watched her expensive new fence transform into a grotesque, twisted sculpture that now curved entirely onto her own property, freeing Martin's driveway completely. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind died. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the creaking of the warped metal as it settled into its new configuration. Jerome appeared at Martin's side, his expression serene. "Well now, isn't that interesting?" he remarked, as if commenting on an unusual cloud formation. "Steel posts don't ordinarily bend like that, do they?" "This isn't possible," Martin whispered, staring at the contorted fence. "Metal doesn't just warp like that in the wind." Jerome nodded sagely. "Unless the wind had help." Across the yard, Elaine stood frozen on her porch, her face drained of color. Her eyes darted between the ruined fence and Martin, accusations forming on her lips but dying before they. Martin awoke to pounding on his front door. The bedside clock read 6:17 a.m., too early for casual visitors. Throwing on a robe, he stumbled downstairs to find his stone-faced Elaine standing on his porch, flanked by two men. One wore the uniform of the county surveyor's office. The other, a cheap suit and an expression of practiced authority, handed Martin a business card identifying him as Gregory Winters, attorney at law. "Your brother, I presume?" Martin said to Elaine, noting the shared surname. "My son," she corrected coldly. "We're here to address the vandalism of my property." Martin leaned against the doorframe. "Vandalism? I haven't touched your fence, Ms. Winters." Gregory stepped forward. "Mr. Shaw, we have reason to believe you've employed some method to sabotage my mother's fence. Twice. The damage pattern is inconsistent with natural phenomena." "You're accusing me of what exactly?" "Command over the elements." Martin couldn't help but laugh. "Have you considered that perhaps your fence was simply built in the wrong place?" The county surveyor, a thin man with a drooping mustache, cleared his throat. "That's why I'm here, sir. We're going to resurvey both properties today with representatives from both parties present." Martin nodded. "Fine by me." "Excellent," Gregory said. "We'll begin in 1 hour. And Mr. Shaw, if evidence of tampering is found, we'll be pursuing both civil and criminal charges." After they left, Martin called Jerome, who arrived minutes later carrying a folder of yellow documents. "These are the original subdivision plans," Jerome explained, spreading them on Martin's kitchen table. "My brother-in-law kept meticulous records. This shows the true property lines as established in 1973, before any of these houses were built." Martin studied the documents. According to the original plans, his driveway was entirely on his property with almost 2 feet to spare. "She falsified the survey," he muttered. "But how did she get the county to accept it?" Jerome's expression darkened. Money talks, and her son being a lawyer probably helped grease the wheels. An hour later, the surveyor began his work, placing markers and taking measurements while Martin, Jerome, Elaine, and Gregory observed. The twisted fence now stood several feet inside what Elaine claimed was her property line, its metal posts contorted into impossible angles that the surveyor kept studying with obvious confusion. "I've never seen metal deform quite like this," he remarked, running his hands along a bent post. "Almost looks like it was heated and twisted." "Focus on the survey, please," Gregory instructed sharply. By mid-morning, the surveyor had established a preliminary line that closely matched what Jerome's documents showed, confirming that Martin's driveway was indeed fully on his property. Elaine's face grew increasingly pinched as each measurement contradicted her claims. "This can't be right," she insisted. "Your equipment must be miscalibrated." The surveyor, clearly offended, adjusted his glasses. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 27 years. My equipment is fine." "Let me see those original documents again," Gregory demanded, snatching the folder from Jerome's hands. As he flipped through the pages, his professional demeanor began to crack. These could be fabricated. We need carbon dating and authentication. Be my guest, Jerome replied calmly. The county archives have copies filed with the original development permits. Gregory's face flushed. He pulled his mother aside, and a heated whispered exchange followed, with Elaine gesturing emphatically toward the fence and Gregory repeatedly shaking his head. Meanwhile, the sky above had begun to change again. What had started as a clear morning was now punctuated by scattered clouds that seemed to be gathering directly overhead. The air grew heavy with moisture and the distinct scent of ozone. Your mother falsified that survey, didn't she? Martin said quietly when Gregory returned. That's fraud. We're prepared to settle this amicably, Gregory replied stiffly, ignoring the accusation. We'll restore the original property line and compensate you for any inconvenience. Martin crossed his arms. And the fence will be removed entirely, Gregory conceded, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. Elaine stepped forward, vibrating with indignation. I am not removing that fence. This is my property. These men are all conspiring against me. She jabbed a finger toward the surveyor, who took a step back. You can bribe clearly. Ms. Winters, please calm down, the surveyor began, but Elaine was beyond reasoning. I will not be dictated to by you people, she shrieked, marching toward the twisted fence. This is my land. 1 week after the fence's spectacular demise, an uneasy peace had settled over the neighborhood. Martin had seen no sign of Elaine, though lights in her house indicated she remained in residence. The twisted heap of metal and wood had been hauled away by a junk removal service, leaving behind bare earth where the fence had stood. Already grass was beginning to reclaim the disturbed soil, erasing the last physical evidence of the boundary dispute. Martin sat on his front porch with Jerome, sharing a pitcher of iced tea and watching the sunset. It had been an unusually beautiful week. Perfect temperatures, gentle breezes, and skies so vividly blue they almost hurt to look at. Think she's learned her lesson? Martin asked, nodding toward Elaine's house. Jerome chuckled. Hard to say. Some folks are more stubborn than others. But when Mother Nature decides to teach you something, the class doesn't end until the lesson sticks. As if on cue, the front door of Elaine's Victorian swung open. The woman herself emerged, looking markedly different from the imperious neighbor who had declared war with her fence. Her silver hair hung loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual rigid style. She wore simple gardening clothes and carried a small potted plant in her hands. Martin and Jerome watched in silence as Elaine hesitated at the edge of her porch, then squared her shoulders and walked directly toward them. Good evening, she said stiffly when she reached Martin's yard. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Martin replied, surprised by her appearance at his door. Can I help you with something? Elaine's eyes darted between Martin and Jerome, then focused on the space between the properties where her fence had stood. I've come to, she paused, clearly struggling with the words. I've come to apologize. Martin exchanged a glance with Jerome, who raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. The survey was altered, Elaine continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Gregory arranged it. He thought he was helping me expand my property. I encouraged him, she swallowed hard. After what happened last week, he confessed everything. He's afraid he might be disbarred. I see, Martin said carefully. That was a serious fraud attempt. Yes, Elaine's shoulders slumped. We're working with the county to correct the records. Gregory is cooperating fully. She held out the potted plant, a small tree sapling. This is a peace offering. A dogwood. I thought perhaps we could plant it together where the fence used to be, as a new boundary marker, one that respects the true property line. The gesture was so unexpected that Martin found himself momentarily speechless. He glanced at Jerome, who gave a subtle nod of approval. That's a fine idea, Martin finally said. A living boundary seems more appropriate than a fence. Relief visibly washed over Elaine's features. I've been having the strangest dreams, she confessed suddenly. Dreams of being buried alive, of the earth swallowing me whole, and wind voices whispering warnings in my ear. I've never been superstitious, but her voice trailed off as she looked up at the perfect blue sky. I can't help feeling that something was trying to communicate with me. The world speaks to us in many ways, Jerome offered cryptically. Some people just need louder reminders than others. Elaine nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her now. Would tomorrow morning be convenient for planting the tree? That would be fine, Martin agreed. After Elaine had returned to her house, Jerome leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile. Well now, isn't that something? Seems the lesson took after all. You really believe the earth itself intervened? Martin asked, still struggling to reconcile the events of the past 2 weeks with his understanding of reality. Jerome shrugged. What I believe doesn't much matter. But consider this, boundaries aren't just lines on paper. They're relationships between people, between communities, between humans and the natural world. When those relationships are honest, everything flourishes. When they're built on deception, he gestured toward the empty space where the fence had stood. The natural order finds ways to restore balance. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Martin emerged from his house to find Elaine already waiting by the property line, sapling in one hand, gardening trowel in the other. Together, they dug a hole precisely on the boundary, half on Martin's property, half on Elaine's, and planted the young dogwood.